Okay, so my name is Corey Habecker. I'm here with Josiah Henley, who will introduce himself when his segment begins. But I am a principal at Holst Architecture and also the sustainability director. I've worked at Holst for a number of years, and if in that time have worked on a number of projects for a particular client who has his fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak. But sustainability is a big driver and a big motivator for him. We did a path house for him back in 2013. We've done some spec office buildings with really high sustainability goals for him. And then shortly, actually, while that office building was under construction, he approached us with an opportunity to work in the country of Bhutan on the Jigme SingyeWangchuck School of Law Library. It's a little bit of a long, complicated story about how that all transpired and how we ended up actually designing the library, which I'll go over on a little bit. But essentially, this client has a foundation that does charitable work in Bhutan to help them understand and prepare and adapt for the effects of climate change. And I'll kind of describe some of the reasoning behind that. Bhutan, if you're at all familiar, oftentimes in the news they talk about the gross national happiness index that they operate under at a governmental level. But like culturally, they're very concerned about the environment, and they have environmental controls actually built into the constitution. So there's already kind of a baseline level of desire uh, for sustainability and kind of protect the environment, understanding the effects of what their behavior is on their environment. So these are kind of signs that you'll see around the country. It's sort of ever present. One of the reasons, a couple of reasons for the genesis of the project, the country of Bhutan is particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They are a primarily high altitude country in the Himalayas, and they are also largely agrarian. Their economics. So many people being farmers would be affected by changes to precipitation or temperature. So at that level, they're vulnerable. But also, this chart here shows their exports. India is by far and away their predominant economic partner, and their chief exports to India are electricity and metals. The electricity is all provided via run-of-the-river hydroelectric plants, which operate basically on the current flow of any river that they're on. So there is no reservoir there. If precipitation is disrupted, the electricity production can be disrupted, and so that would have pretty negative economic impacts to them. The other factor that we've had to consider, and they're struggling with constantly, is their position in the world. It's a very small, physically small country, and also in terms of population, quite small. Their population is something like 900,000 people, and they're surrounded by China and India on the north and south, both well over a billion. Nepal and Bangladesh on either side as well. Nepal is like 15 million. Bangladesh is something like 150 million people. So just really behemoths of demographics sort of all around them. And they have this tiny little population and a very unique culture. And they're very concerned about um, that culture getting overwhelmed by their neighbors. And so have very tight and strict controls on immigration and visitation. But also, they're looking at protection of their architectural heritage. And that's kind of where this project plugs in. There are governmental rules about for government buildings adhering to certain design considerations. And so in our process, we always had to be respectful of the traditional architectural forms. The architectural forms that are predominant in the country are, basically, I think this image here sort of covers a lot of it. This is actually the Capitol building in Thimphu, which is their capital city. In this image, you can see in the central area is like an administrative building, and to the left is a monastery. This is all within what's called a zong, which is sort of a fortress administrative complex, which I'll kind of talk about in a minute. But the architectural forms are really these massive battered walls at the base made of stone masonry or rammed earth with smaller punched windows in them. And then on top of and to the side of. A lot of times you'll see at the top, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this top story there is all like timber framed. So inside of the masonry walls, all the floors are timber framed, and then that kind of pops out and explodes out in certain ways on top of, or in the case of the monastery, you can see there's sort of a projection to the side of the rammed earth masonry, or this is a stone masonry wall. And above that is what's commonly called a flying roof. It's a roof form that extends out quite a bit past the perimeter of the building. And what's unique about it is a lot of times there's a lot of layering, which isn't unique to Bhutan. You see that a lot around Asia. But what's unique to Bhutan, I think, is that roof is elevated above the top, above the ceiling, essentially the top floor, and air can flow above that. And so I'll talk a bit about how we respected that tradition, but there's also a strong tradition of culture, a tradition of craft in the country. So all of that woodwork and all that masonry that you saw is all done by hand. There's very little like heavy machinery there, and so one of our drives was try to preserve that and continue that along in our project because. All of that sort of being supplanted commonly in the country by more modern techniques. So here, instead of actual carved wood, there's a lot of fiber reinforced concrete panels being made and put onto buildings. They're also adopting new construction techniques for the whole building. So instead of masonry and timber, it's a lot of reinforced concrete frames with masonry infill, and then they stucco over that. But as it impacts what we were doing, I had mentioned earlier that the impetus behind this was the foundation's desire to help Bhutan adapt to climate change. A component of that for much of the country is like it's kind of a colder climate. They don't really insulate their buildings. They use a lot of single pane glazing. They're really not familiar with using sealant to seal up gaps. So they've got drafty, cold buildings. And our thought was that in working with them on the library, we can kind of move the needle in terms of sustainability and sustainable construction techniques with this project. So trying to use as much as we can with what they're familiar with and what's efficient there, but also layer on another component of insulation, air sealing, and efficiency. So I mentioned the kind of newer techniques. This is becoming very commonplace throughout the country. They're urbanizing quite rapidly. So they're building tons and tons of these apartment buildings with these uninsulated, essentially envelopes. They're also incorporating a lot of elements from, like India predominantly. Like this mirrored glass really isn't effective in this climate, but it's readily available. And, I encountered this, especially when we were starting the project, trying to find like source insulation materials. Well, they bring in a bunch of salespeople from India, and like they're not familiar with what we're looking for, so they're bringing us like duct liner and stuff like that instead of proper insulation. So it's a lot of like what's available, what's at hand, and what can we do. That was kind of a challenge for this project. So, kind of in summary, they have a strong desire to be sustainable. They're not building very sustainable right now. This was an opportunity to kind of elevate or do something new in the country and get people familiar with these techniques. The client that we were working for is really, I mentioned he had constructed a passive house, really a believer in that technology. But Passive House is just kind of a component of a universe of high performance building techniques. So we were really, that was our mission, was to kind of deploy those technologies in this project. And that happened in two different phases. So phase one, circled here, is kind of the whole campus for the project, which included like classrooms and dormitories and administrative spaces for the school, a dining hall, and that sort of thing. And then the library here in the foreground, which came later. So we were initially brought in just to do technical advising to the Bhutanese architects who are working on phase one. And so we started with those traditional construction techniques, here, these are sketches of like how it's typically built with the masonry towards the bottom, and then these wooden projections that get built above. And then up in the upper right, here's a diagram of the flying roof, where you can kind of see there's basically a cap on the top story and then the framing above. So we wanted to, as much as we could, emulate those sorts of things, but implement, like I said, layer in layers of insulation and air sealing techniques. So a lot of the early process was just me like doing sketches about how that could happen. So again, like lowering the bar for them. So still using reinforced concrete frames, still using the masonry infill, still doing, and then also doing the things that kind of respect the architectural heritage with the battered walls and the projecting wood framing. But really like hidden inside all of that, we try to sneak in a layer of insulation and air sealing. So there's a lot of back and forth with like sketches and like, can you do this? And like, do you have that available? And working through those problems with them. Ultimately, though, they started building phase one, and we were asked to design the library, which is sort of a standalone component. And so we fell back on, how you do high performance building was just kind of look at the massing first and kind of strategize around shading and positioning and that sort of thing. So here are some images of that. And then I'll talk about a little bit about the detail of like how the guts of the building work, but just kind of touch on some of the exterior images here. You can see how we've incorporated the traditional forms, but also kind of like put a little bit of a asymmetrical spin on it. So there's the batter walls and the flying roof and the projecting wood frames, but it's sort of tilted or off center so that it looks to capture the views. There's a view over the valley that this is positioned on, sort of over your right shoulder here. So there's a large double height reading room there, which is sort of positioned to take advantage of that view. Closer view at the entry. Again, like really trying to bring in the artisanal craftsman kind of element, both in woodwork, but also they do amazing masonry work. We didn't really even have to discuss like how we wanted the stone walls to work. They just like did this amazing work. And then the walls, actually, the white wall that you see here is actually AAC block, so autoclaved aerated concrete, faced over with some stucco. And we did that because it provided some level of insulation. And that was done on phase one as well. Here you see kind of some detail of the library on the left and the elements of phase one on the right. And it's funny that I still call it phase one. It's the only phase, really. But yeah, so this is kind of a little terrace on the south, taking advantage of the daylight and really trying to work in some, like really taking advantage of the beauty of the masonry work and create some details that are compelling. So when it comes to kind of how the building is configured, we took inspiration from the Zong, which is, as I mentioned before, this administrative monastery fortress kind of thing. And as you enter these Zongs, there's never like a straight route in. There's always like a little circuitous path because of its nature as a fortress. You don't want a big open gate into the building. So looking at that and looking at like how we could configure it, and there was some I think congruency between how a library operates and how a fortress operates. You don't want people just like walking in and grabbing the books and walking out. There's always like a control point. And so we kind of took advantage of that in the floor plan here. And hopefully it's not too small, but in the lower left, you'll see the ground floor plan where you come in off the terrace in front of the building, and you can take a left or take a right past the sort of library control point, or to the left is a textile display, and then ultimately make it your way to the central organizing element, which is the stair that connects all three floors. Another component of the cultural inspiration that we looked at a lot was the tradition of Bhutanese textiles. They do a lot of really beautiful textile work, oftentimes, most often done by women. And one of our drivers was to try to celebrate that and to shine a light on what they're doing and some of the work they're doing. So on the ground floor, there's a textile display that shows some really beautiful works, but we also tried to like weave that in pun not intended actually, to the design in some of the elements that we put into the building. Also, in addition to some of those textile patterns, you see a lot of this really ornate painting and decorative work on buildings. So that was sort of another source of inspiration. And the way that manifested itself in the building was what we ended up calling the mosaic wall, which is adjacent to the stair that runs through the building. And you can see it here on the left, which is it's just a series of blocks of 4x4 end cuts of wood attached to the wall in a pattern, a repeating pattern that goes up the entire height of the stair. And so with like the way that the shadow hits it, it really kind of, I feel like, emulates some of that patterning of the textiles. Another element that we looked at a lot was the carpet of the reading room. On the right here, you'll see the double height reading space, and looking at different patterns for that. And we ended up developing using, again, because what materials are available there is sort of limited by what they can get from India. Finding a carpet manufacturer that had a selection of carpet tiles that we could work with and kind of creating our own pattern there. You can see it a little bit better here. And actually the furniture, unfortunately, obscures kind of the most interesting part, which is in the center. But it sort of is red and orange around the perimeter and builds up to like more turquoise and purple in the center. I did want to call attention to the workers and the Bhutanese who helped us on this. Certainly wouldn't have been possible without their advice. There were technical advisors present throughout the process that were hired by the foundation that I worked for, but also like a whole myriad of amazing Bhutanese workers. They had architects that worked for the law school who connected us with traditional design experts, and they would provide feedback on our design moves and how the details worked. And like the proportions of all those elements that you saw are very like strictly dictated about like, well, that needs to be 2x1, and this sort of cornice is assembled this way. So their help on that was invaluable. But also I wanted to call attention to the workers and really celebrate them. Like they built this through the pandemic in really pretty brutal conditions. With the Bhutan lockdown was very severe, and they persevered through it all and really came through and built an amazing, amazing building. Yeah, I think that is the conclusion of what I have to say. I think what we decided was Josiah was going to go right after me, and we could take questions at the end. So, Josiah, do you want to take over?
Yeah. Thanks, Corey. Let's see. My name's Josiah Henley. I'm a senior associate here at Holst Architecture. And back in starting 2016, Corey and I actually, with some others in our office, had the opportunity to work on this really interesting, challenging, and wonderful project called the Nick Fish. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about this building and that process. This is for those who don't know, it's a 86,000+ square foot multifamily housing project located in the Gateway neighborhood. And real quick, the partners on the project, this was for our Just Future, formerly known as Human Solutions, Edlin and Company, and Prosper Portland. And we worked closely with LMC Construction, who built the project, KPFF Civil Engineers, Place Landscape Architects, MFIA, MEP Engineers, and Katina Structural Engineers. The project it's 75 housing units, and it's actually a mix of both affordable and market rate. There's 52 affordable units in this building and 23 market rate. And those are a mix of studios, 1 bedrooms, and 2 bedrooms. But the building is also serves as the office headquarters for our Just Future. And it also has about 10,000, or the office is 10,000 square feet, but it also has about 9,000 square feet of retail space that's operated by Prosper Portland. And they prioritize BIPOC small businesses in that retail space. So pretty complex program. All that wrapped up in a building that also has amenity spaces, a parking lot for 60 cars. So yeah, I guess going back, the original goal of the project was to develop a catalytic project in the Gateway neighborhood that would be responsive to the community's voice and be a community asset. And I think one of the ways I threw this slide in here for anybody who was curious about that market rate and affordable housing part. I don't know a whole lot about the financing, but if you have questions, you feel free to drop your email and I can connect you to people who can answer them and related to the financing model. But it is a mix of new market tax credits and LIHTC funding. But the project, has a long history. Um, the park was, there's information missing. There's supposed to be dates on this, but that aren't showing up on the PDF. But back in 2008, actually, Prosper and Portland Parks bought the site. It's a 4-acre site and started developing the park, which is now known as Gateway Discovery Park. And then I believe, can't remember the date when the RFQ started, but we were awarded the project in 2016. So it's been a long process. And after we were awarded the project, there was a 2-year public engagement process, which actually we should really say 3 years because that engagement process continued on into design. We were still going to community engagement meetings for probably a year after that design phase started. A lot of community engagement. Dave Audie in our office spent a long time going to lots of different meetings, meeting with different community leaders, and hearing from neighbors about their concerns, their hopes, their dreams for the site. I think there was a lot of public interest in the site. It was very prominent. I think it had been a vacant lot for a long time. So I think a lot of people had invested interest in what it was going to shape out to be. I think Corey and I were involved in a lot of that community engagement process. We even, went to someone's house and had tea with them and, went over different design ideas and addressed his concerns. And so it was a very, very intense and intimate process with the neighbors, which I think was really fruitful and rewarding. And I think overall was a benefit for the building. So this is where the site is. It's really close to the I-205 and 84 junction. It's on Halsey and 106th, and you see there that our project, the building is actually facing Halsey, and the park is sort of behind the building. And so the building's integration with the park was really important for the design. And like I said, the park was actually designed and built before we started work on the project. So a lot of what was already done went into informing our design. And these are some slides, this is a slide with some options that we created for that public engagement process. And there was a lot of discussion about how the building was going to sit on the site adjacent to the park. One of the complexities of the project is how do you design for a site that basically has 3 main facades. It's a 4-sided site. You really want active program on all 3 of those 4 sites. And so how do you accomplish that? And what we ended up with was something similar to what you see in option C, which was to locate the office and retail along Halsey Street and sort of in a lower massing that's more appropriate to the neighborhood, and then locate the housing portion along the park side to sort of get more eyes on the park and screen some of that interior parking. And so this is just a diagram that explains those different challenges and how we sort of attempted to solve those. You can see active uses on 3 of those 4 sides. That's retail, amenity spaces, and bike parking. Trying to screen that parking from the park. The massing that's located on Halsey is sort of at street scale. It's a lot of 2-3-story buildings, and so the lower part of the massing that has the office is located there. I mentioned eyes on the park. The housing housing massing was pushed to the backside facing the park, and then sort of the ends sort of respond to what's happening adjacent there. There's a public plaza here on this would be the northeast corner of the site. And so the building sort of breaks down and responds there programmatically. And this is an aerial view. It's actually a rendering. It looks like a real photo, but this sort of explains what we came up with. You can see in the foreground is that public plaza with some smaller buildings on it, and then our building has retail on the ground floor there, and then steps up to the housing part that's facing the park. I did want to mention on this slide, we worked closely with Brightworks as well, and in a series of eco-charrettes with them to target sort of strategies for achieving the LEED certification that we got. I didn't mention before, but this building is LEED multifamily mid-rise gold certified. And so there were a lot of meetings that we had to sort of target priorities that would help get us there. I think the site itself had a lot of benefits. It's close to public transportation. There's ample green space for the residents. But there's a lot of things that also helped us get our certification. It's not shown in this rendering, but there is a PV array on the roof. We got a Green Streets grant to design a nicer sort of public right-of-way in front of the building. So there's bioswales and plantings along there too. So just jumping into the plans to give you a better idea of how the building lays out here. You can see there's a real effort to try to create a lot of active use along park edges and the street. So at the top is Halsey Street, and so that's where a lot of the retail is located. And then retail, which is number 3, is located along the plaza here. And then we wrap sort of amenity spaces for the residents towards the back of the building. And then we have bike parking screening that interior parking lot. There is a bit of parking lot that sort of like ekes out of the building and faces the park, but there was already screening there. There was planting there to sort of screen that. We built a fence there to sort of shield headlights from people in the park. One thing to mention, one of the challenges of placing the housing massing back along the park side is that zoning requires the main entrance to be on the main street. So you end up with sort of this long corridor like lobby that brings people from the front of the building back to where the elevator is to get you up into the housing part. We have a housing entrance on the park as well, but that's sort of a secondary entrance. But knowing that there's only 60 parking spots for 75 units plus an office, and so people are parking along the streets and in the neighborhood. So people are walking through the park, which I think is great and activates the park. So having an entrance on the backside of the building is beneficial too. And there's also shared storage to be used by Portland Parks in our actual building. So that's sort of adjacent to the bike parking here. And going up, you can see the floor plan of the office. It's sort of a mix of private offices and open office with meeting rooms, lots of smaller meeting rooms, and then a couple larger conference rooms that flank an outdoor deck. And then sort of a typical housing bar on the southern portion of the site. So actually, I'm going to go back a couple slides here. You'll notice in the background, there's these large mature trees on the edge of the park that really are very noticeable when you're in the park. They're sort of bookending one side of the park and creating sort of a backdrop. And so our building was on the opposite end of that, and we really wanted the building to sort of act as that other bookend for the park and create a backdrop. And so using the trees, those large trees as inspiration, we sort of came up with a patterning for the facade that sort of mimicked that vertical patterning and shifted that with the massing of the building to create patterning with windows and the facade materials. Those materials are textured brick, reflective metal panel, and to create that patterning. And so as you move around the backside of the building and get to the plaza, that materiality sort of breaks down and the building actually becomes quieter. And that was intentional to respond to the program of the plaza. This plaza has markets, concerts, and other events that happen. And so the facade sort of quiets down to act as a backdrop for that active space and where the retail is located as well. So the building becomes a backdrop there. And this is another view sort of around on the Halsey side, looking at that plaza facade. There is actually, I should mention, some you see it in this photo. It's sort of all around the building, and even on the park side, there's planters with star jasmine, which is a climbing plant. And last time I saw the project, it was actually doing pretty well. So I hope that there's still a lot of greenery on the building there. And so moving to the interiors, one of the really neat things about this building is there's a consistent level of finish in the units across all the units between the market rate and the affordable. This is really important to our team, just both in terms of equity. I think everyone, deserves the same level of finish, but also it's helpful for the owner as they're, if that unit mix between affordable and market rate changes up, they can move those around the building and it's still the same unit. So that's a neat aspect to highlight. And this is a view of the community room that's just off the park. You can see it towards the left there. And then in the office space, it's one of the things I didn't mention, the construction of this building, it's a type 1 podium on the ground floor, but then above that in the office, it's actually type 5. So there's, glulam, heavy timber throughout. So we sort of use that as a finish. And so there's a mix of like warm finishes throughout the space, a lot of wood, lots of ample daylight, open space, lighter finishes. And then this is a view of coming upstairs into their lobby here. You can see those large windows looking out onto the Halsey Street there. And then this is a great shot of that roof deck that happens between the office portion on the right and then the housing massing on the left there. And then I'll end, for those who don't know, the building is named after the late Commissioner Nick Fish here in Portland. He was an advocate for affordable housing, parks, and small businesses. He passed away in 2020, so the building is named after him. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Anybody have any questions?
You guys have to have questions or else I'm not going to be able to count this as a CE because it's only 37 minutes long. So
I can talk more. I was trying to be efficient.
Could I ask you to talk about the community engagement process? I was thinking of the last project, but maybe there's an interesting one for the first one as well.
Well, yeah, I'll let Josiah talk. There wasn't a lot of community engagement because with the library, the school hadn't really been established yet, so the student body wasn't there. It's a very rural area. There's not really even any residents around, so it's pretty much in a vacuum. I think our engagement really was with the architects and the tech team over there, and understanding a lot more about. You can kind of look at the book and try to emulate the architectural forms and the architectural language, but finding out the priorities and figuring out how all that really goes together was sort of our engagement and understanding where they're coming from.
Very beautiful results in both cases.
Thank you.
For the Nick Fish, I think it's a lot of meetings with different stakeholders. It's a lot of trying to get out information to people who live in the neighborhood and setting up, presentations for them. And it's a lot of work that happens later in the day to give people, opportunity to show up after they have a long day at work or something like that. So you're not meeting, when people are not able to attend. So it's trying to meet people where they are. But yeah, I went to a few of those public ones, but I know there was a lot of meetings with like neighborhood groups in the area and different business groups. And finding the people who are going to be the champion for the project too. Trying to identify those people and meeting with them regularly and keeping feedback loops going. That was part of what Corey and I did when we went to this gentleman's house who lives nearby to talk to him. He actually, there was the building looked a lot different. I think before in terms of palette, it was probably a little louder, I would say, if I had to say, and he had some concerns about that, and so we met with him at his house and talked through it, and he sort of understood where we came from, and we understood where he came from, and I think working with him, got to a better place that was not as loud a building and nicer, in my opinion.
Yeah, really agreeable. It ended up being, I'm really pleased with the result.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a couple in the chat now. I don't know if you guys can see them. A couple of questions. Libby asks, could you talk about design and construction in Bhutan during the pandemic?
Yes. So my engagement with this project started in 2015, actually, with our first visit there and meeting all the players involved and learning about the context of the project. And then design for the library didn't really begin in earnest till 2017, I believe. And then construction was in 2018. They have kind of an interesting way of building things. It seems very much more informal than here. Schedule is not as critical. Costs are a lot of guesstimates. And so that was a little bit challenging, but also like the construction process often drags. And you'll see this a lot in places around the world where they'll build like half a building and kind of stop construction for some time. That's pretty common in Bhutan as well. That wasn't the priority here. Obviously they have a school to get up and running, and they need a library. So there was definitely a desire to never stop construction, but it dragged into the pandemic. And once the pandemic hit, the country of Bhutan took some pretty severe, extreme measures in terms of locking down their borders, and even within the country, traveling within the country was very challenging and restricted. And so getting materials in and getting people in was very difficult. I didn't mention this because I didn't know how long I was going to end up talking, but part of Bhutan's big challenge in the construction industry is there's not a lot of desire of the population to enter the construction industry and enter the trades. There is a tradition of craft, but it's sort of diminishing. People are tending to want to do more, civil service work, office work, and less work with their hands, just as a general population. And so a lot of the actual labor is sort of being handed off to migrant workers from India who come in on 6-month visas and then have to leave. They can't stay longer than that. And that's all part of that cultural protection sort of aspect. They don't want, accumulations of Indian workers staying there for long term. So any skills that they accrue while they're there go back to India with them, and they oftentimes don't come back. And so it's pretty challenging, and even more so during the pandemic when nobody's crossing the borders. So they had shortages of materials, shortages of workers, and the whole process really ground down to a very slow crawl. So it ended up taking about 5 years to build, from groundbreaking to when they actually occupied the building. A large part of that, I'd say probably 2 years of that, is because of the pandemic. Did that answer the question? Okay. Another question. How do you see residents using the community room and roof deck in the winter months? Or are you always curious about the amenity they bring?
Yeah, that's a good question. One we ask ourselves about when we do these types of projects a lot. The roof deck is only for the office, actually. I don't know if I made that clear. So that's our Just Future folks who are using that. It may be available. I know that the large conference room is available to rent out for people that live in the area. And so it's maybe available to use for them. So, but the community room, I don't know. I was there. I was trying to think the last time I was there. I've visited the project a few times, and it's pretty sparsely used, but it was also pandemic. I think when I first went there too. Our hope is that being on the park, it's sort of lively and activated. Um, we do have a door that opens up onto it. I think we originally envisioned a larger sort of connection, like physical connection, but I think that was really challenging in terms of security, being on a public park, and not being able to control that access point. We would love, for that to just be like an large opening, and people are sort of filtering in and out of that space. But I think logistically that was really hard, especially being so far. Um, you can see in this plan, the offices are along Halsey at the top there. And so that's where a lot of the Artist Future or the property management staff is located. And it's very far from the community room. So I think that's a challenge for that community room. I think it's more successful in projects when it's closer to staff in the building. So that was something that, was kind of a challenge on this project. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I don't know, like metrics wise, how much it's being used. I think that would be a great question to ask our Just Future what they've seen in terms of use in the building.
Do you think the position of the building also makes it a little more challenging because it's on the ground floor and all the housing's above?
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Yeah, it was put there kind of as a way to bridge the connection between the park and the residents. But yeah, kind of curious. We should maybe do a post-occupancy evaluation and find out
Yeah, we should
how much
actually.
it's being used and why or why not.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, one of the challenges of this site is we needed, active ground floor use on as much of that facade as possible on this project. I think they were even wanting more, like, the bike parking is technically not active use, but we had, we made an argument for it. There's people going in and out of there.
So you think if it had been located up by the housing, it might be a little bit more heavily trafficked?
I could see it being located on the second floor, like where the having another roof deck that was accessible by the residents. I think that would be nice in my opinion, because you're sort of up off the main public realm. It's sort of like how stoops are successful because they're sort of above the right of way, and you have that sort of like buffered space from the busy street. I think that could be potentially more successful.
Cool, thank you.
How did you get hired for the Bhutan project, competition or personal relationship? That was a personal relationship all the way. I did mention this early on in my talk, but actually I started at Holst in 2005, just forever ago. But like the first thing I worked on when I worked at Holst was initial concept for a house for this client of ours. That house didn't go forward, but then in 2010 he came back with a different site, and that was the Pacifist that we did called the Karuna House, which was like 2010 to 2013, and then kind of rolling right from that into the office buildings that we worked on for him called One North, which is on Williams and Vancouver and Fremont. And those were highly sustainable office buildings, largely mass timber, basically built with all kinds of Passive House principles, even though we didn't get certified or didn't pursue certification, I should say. And then this Bhutan project. So for basically from 2010 until 2022, when the Bhutan project wrapped up, I was in this guy's orbit. So a lot of projects for this individual, but really really doing a lot of good, I think, and really concerned about his impact on the planet and ways in which his projects can like influence people to do better. So I think I mentioned the Bhutan project, really, the genesis was they're building a law school. Maybe I skipped over this, but they're building a law school. Let's build it sustainably. And so the future leaders of Bhutan who are likely to kind of pass through this law school will understand the benefits of sustainable design, understand the comfort benefits of high performance design, and maybe that can influence the policies that they write when they're, in positions of power.
I have a question. For the Nick Fish, you said you got LEED certification, right?
Yeah.
But this is an affordable housing project. Were there any specific design strategies you had to use to make it affordable to make it affordable, if you understand what I'm saying, to make it sustainable?
Yeah, you're asking, like, your certification is expensive,
Yeah.
and doing the things to get certified is expensive.
Yes.
I think on the flip side, a lot of the things required to get certified are it produces a more robust building. And I think a lot of affordable housing developers are interested in finishes, systems, things that are going to last and not require, since they're long-term owners of the building, they're not going to sell the building. They're interested in, a higher level of quality we found historically on a lot of our affordable housing projects. So it's maybe not what you would expect, but a lot of these developers are interested in pursuing certification and doing the things that make their buildings higher quality and longer lasting because of that aspect.
Cheaper in the long run.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other questions?
Well,
Okay.
I guess we can quit a little bit early. We're still in the right amount for CE, so we're good. Thank you guys.
The minimum.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you guys very much for your presentation, and I'm hoping that Holst will come back because they did in fact get another award this year and tell us about their further projects.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.